A teacher slaps a black boy during class, believing her authority is untouchable. But when he screams, "My dad is your boss," her world starts to crumble. The students stare in stunned silence, one of them secretly recording the chaos. What she thought was a small act of control quickly spirals into a nightmare she can't escape. How did it come to this? What will his father do when he sees the video? And can she stop the storm that's about to hit? Or has it already begun? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The fluorescent lights hummed steadily in room 203 of Wellington Preparatory Academy, where Mrs. Collins stood at attention before her 8th grade class, her spine as rigid as the ruler she gripped in her perfectly manicured hands. Her salt and pepper hair was pulled back into a tight bun, not a single strand out of place, just the way she liked everything in her classroom. "In this class," she announced, her voice crisp and stern, "we maintain order and discipline at all times. Excellence is not optional, it is expected." Her heels clicked against the polished floor as she paced between the rows of desks, examining each student with hawk-like precision. Jordan Daniels sat straight in his chair, his dark eyes following Mrs. Collins's movement. He'd heard about her from other students, how she seemed to have different rules for different students, though she'd never admit it. His father had taught him to always carry himself with dignity, and that's exactly what he planned to do. "Now," Mrs. Collins continued, "I trust you've all completed the assigned reading on colonial America?" She paused, her gaze lingering a fraction longer on the few minority students in the class. "Perhaps we should start with those who might find this material challenging." Jordan felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the same feeling he got whenever adults tried to make him feel smaller than he was. But instead of shrinking, he raised his hand with confidence. "Yes, Mr. Daniels." Mrs. Collins's tone carried a hint of suspicion. "I found it interesting how the textbook glosses over certain aspects of colonial history," Jordan said clearly. "It's almost like some perspectives were deliberately left out. Kind of like when someone only tells the parts of the story that make them look good." His comment drew quiet chuckles from his classmates. Mrs. Collins's lips pressed into a thin line. "That's quite enough, Mr. Daniels. We stick to the curriculum here." Later that day, Mrs. Collins marched into Principal Grant's office, her face flushed with indignation. "That Daniels boy is becoming a problem," she declared, dropping into the chair across from his desk. "He's disruptive, disrespectful, and challenges authority at every turn." Principal Grant, a man with kind eyes and graying temples, leaned back in his chair. "Jordan Daniels? The same Jordan Daniels who maintains a 4.0 GPA and leads the debate club?" "Grades aren't everything," Mrs. Collins insisted. "He's creating an atmosphere of defiance in my classroom." "Or perhaps he's demonstrating critical thinking skills," Principal Grant suggested gently. "From what I've observed, Jordan is one of our most promising students." Mrs. Collins left the office with her frustration barely contained, her heels striking the floor with sharp, angry clicks. After school, Jordan and Tasha sat on the bleachers overlooking the empty football field. The autumn breeze rustled through the nearby trees as Tasha hugged her books to her chest. "Did you see how she looked at me when I asked about the homework?" Tasha said quietly. "Like she was surprised I could even form the question." Jordan nodded, his jaw set with determination. "She does it all the time, Tasha. The way she treats us, the way she acts like we don't belong here." He paused, looking at his friend. "My dad always says that staying quiet about wrong things is the same as saying they're right." "But she's a teacher," Tasha whispered, worry creasing her forehead. "What can we do?" Jordan straightened his shoulders, his voice steady and sure. "We can refuse to let her make us feel small. We can show her that we belong here just as much as anyone else. I'm not going to let her intimidate me or any of us anymore." Next day, the history classroom felt particularly tense that morning as Mrs. Collins stood before the whiteboard, her marker squeaking against its surface. She wrote, "The Civil Rights Movement," in sharp, angular letters before turning to face the class with a tight smile. "Today, we'll discuss this challenging period in American history," she announced, her eyes fixing deliberately on Jordan Daniels. "Mr. Daniels, since you seem to have so many opinions about historical perspectives, perhaps you'd like to start us off." Jordan sat up straighter. maintaining his composure despite the obvious challenge in her tone. "Of course, Mrs. Collins. Which aspect would you like me to address?" "Tell us about the effectiveness of peaceful protests during this era," she said, her voice carrying a subtle edge. "Or do you believe more aggressive approaches would have been better?" Several students shifted uncomfortably in their seats, recognizing the loaded nature of her question. Jordan took a deep breath, remembering his father's words about dignity under pressure. The peaceful protests were effective precisely because they highlighted the contrast between the protesters' dignity and their opponents' hatred. Jordan responded clearly. Dr. King understood that moral authority often speaks louder than physical force. Mrs. Collins's lips tightened. "And what makes you such an expert on this topic, Mr. Daniels?" "I've read extensively about it, Mrs. Collins. My father made sure I understood my history." Jordan's voice remained steady. "Would you like me to recommend some books?" Scattered giggles erupted from the class. Mrs. Collins's face flushed red. Over the next few weeks, Mrs. Collins seemed determined to find fault with everything Jordan did. When he raised his hand, she ignored him. When he turned in assignments, she scrutinized them for the smallest errors. She marked him tardy when he arrived seconds after the bell, though she regularly overlooked similar timing from other students. "Your paper is late," she declared one morning, holding Jordan's essay between two fingers as if it were contaminated. "I turned it in yesterday, Mrs. Collins," Jordan replied calmly. "I put it directly in your inbox before school." "Well, I didn't see it then, so it's late now," she snapped. "That's 10 points off." Jordan noticed several classmates exchange knowing looks. He simply nodded and returned to his seat, maintaining his dignified silence. Later that day, Mrs. Collins stormed into the teacher's lounge, her face pinched with frustration. She dropped into a chair at the small round table where several other teachers were having lunch. "I can't believe the attitude of some of these students nowadays," she huffed, aggressively stirring her coffee. "Especially that Jordan Daniels. He thinks he knows everything, constantly undermining my authority in front of the entire class." Ms. Rodriguez, the Spanish teacher, looked up from her sandwich with raised eyebrows. "Jordan, he's one of my best students, very respectful and engaged." "Well, he's different in my class," Mrs. Collins insisted, always questioning the curriculum, making subtle comments. "It's like he's trying to make me look bad. Or maybe he's just participating actively in class discussions." Mr. Thompson, the veteran English teacher, suggested carefully. "You might want to be careful about singling out certain students, Sarah. It could be misinterpreted." "Misinterpreted?" Mrs. Collins's voice rose sharply. "Are you implying something?" "I'm just saying that in today's climate, we need to be especially mindful of how we treat all our students," Mr. Thompson replied diplomatically, though his expression carried a clear warning. Mrs. Collins stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "Well, I've been teaching for 20 years, and I know how to handle my classroom," she declared, gathering her things with sharp, angry movements. The next morning's history class started like any other, but there was a crackling tension in the air. Mrs. Collins stood at the front of the room, discussing the treatment of Native Americans during the westward expansion. "The relocation of these peoples was a necessary step in our nation's growth," she stated matter-of-factly, her chalk tapping against the board. Jordan raised his hand, his expression thoughtful. When Mrs. Collins reluctantly called on him, he spoke in a clear, measured voice. "Mrs. Collins, could you clarify what you mean by necessary? Are you suggesting that the forced removal and deaths of thousands of people was justified?" The classroom fell silent. Mrs. Collins's face tightened as she turned fully toward Jordan. "Mr. Daniels, this is a complex historical matter that doesn't need your modern political interpretations." "I'm not being political," Jordan replied calmly. "I'm asking about the facts. How do you justify calling these actions necessary?" Mrs. Collins's hands began to shake slightly as she gripped her textbook tighter. The expansion of our nation required difficult decisions. Sometimes progress comes at a cost. "But whose progress?" Jordan pressed, his voice remaining respectful but firm. "And at whose cost? Shouldn't we examine these events more critically?" The other students watched the exchange with growing interest. Some nodded in agreement with Jordan's questions. Mrs. Collins's face grew increasingly red as she realized she was losing control of the narrative. "That's enough, Mr. Daniels," she snapped. "You're being disruptive again, trying to undermine my authority in this classroom." Jordan sat up straighter in his chair. "I'm just asking you to explain your position, Mrs. Collins. Isn't that what we're supposed to do in history class? Think critically and ask questions?" Something in Mrs. Collins snapped. In 3 quick strides, she crossed to Jordan's desk. Before anyone could react, her hand flew through the air and struck Jordan's cheek with a sharp crack that echoed through the suddenly silent classroom. Gasps filled the room. Several students jumped in their seats. In the back, someone's phone made a subtle recording sound. Jordan didn't flinch or raise his hand to his reddening cheek. Instead, he looked directly into Mrs. Collins's eyes, which were now wide with the realization of what she'd done. "You're in big trouble," Jordan said quietly, his voice steady and clear. "My dad is your boss." The color drained from Mrs. Collins's face as the implications hit her. Principal Grant wasn't just Jordan's defender. He was Jordan's father. She stumbled backward, her hand covering her mouth. The classroom remained frozen in shocked silence. In the 3rd row, Amanda Wilson's phone was partially hidden behind her textbook, its camera lens capturing everything. Mrs. Collins's eyes darted around the room, taking in the stunned faces of her students, the phones that might be recording, and Jordan's unflinching gaze. Her hands began to tremble as she gripped the edge of her desk for support. The carefully maintained control she'd held over her classroom for years had shattered in a single moment of rage. And now, facing Jordan's calm determination, she realized just how completely she had destroyed her own career. The bell rang, making everyone jump. Nobody moved. They all waited, watching the tableau before them. Mrs. Collins frozen in horror, Jordan sitting tall and dignified at his desk, and the heavy weight of consequences hanging in the air between them. As the students filed out of the classroom, Mrs. Collins grabbed Jordan's arm. "Jordan, please stay behind," she said, her voice trembling. She waited until the last student left before closing the door. "Jordan, sweetheart," she began, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "What happened earlier was just a terrible misunderstanding. I'm sure we can work this out between us." Her hands fidgeted with her pearl necklace as she spoke. Jordan stood quietly, his backpack slung over one shoulder, watching her with steady eyes. The red mark on his cheek had begun to fade, but the memory of what she'd done hung heavy in the air between them. "There's no need to involve your father or anyone else," Mrs. Collins continued, her voice growing more desperate. "I've always thought you were one of my brightest students. We could just forget this whole incident happened." She reached out to touch his shoulder, but Jordan took a step back. His silence unnerved her more than any words could have. Mrs. Collins's forced smile crumbled slightly. "Please, Jordan, say something." Jordan adjusted his backpack strap and walked toward the door without a word, leaving Mrs. Collins standing alone in her classroom, her hands shaking. Outside in the parking lot, a group of students huddled around Amanda Wilson's phone. "Watch this part again," Amanda said, replaying the video. The gathered students gasped as they watched the slap for the second time. "My mom's already seen it," Tommy Martinez said, pulling out his own phone. "She's in 3 different parent group chats, and they're all blowing up about it." "Did you see how calm Jordan was?" Sarah Chen whispered. "I would have lost it if a teacher hit me like that." The video spread like wildfire through text messages and social media. Parents began calling each other, their voices filled with concern and anger. Within hours, the incident had become the talk of the entire school community. Meanwhile, Mrs. Collins sat across from Principal Grant in his office, her composure carefully reconstructed. "I want to address something before rumors start spreading," she began, her voice steady despite her internal panic. "I had a difficult situation with Jordan Daniels today." Principal Grant leaned forward in his chair, his expression neutral. "Go on?" "He was being deliberately provocative during class discussions, challenging my authority in front of other students." Mrs. Collins smoothed her skirt, avoiding direct eye contact. "When I tried to restore order, he became confrontational. I may have responded more firmly than usual, but I felt threatened by his behavior." Principal Grant's eyes narrowed slightly. "Threatened? By a student? You know how some of these boys can be, Mrs. Collins said, forcing a laugh. So tall for their age, so intimidating when they want to be. I simply wanted to maintain control of my classroom. Principal Grant sat back, studying her carefully. Something in her story didn't quite add up, but he needed more information before making any decisions. I understand, he said slowly. Let's hold off on any formal action until I can gather more details about the situation. Mrs. Collins's shoulders relaxed slightly, taking his response as a victory. Thank you for understanding, she said, rising from her chair. I knew you'd see it from my perspective. As she turned to leave, Principal Grant noticed her hands were still trembling, despite her composed demeanor. He watched her walk out of his office, the nagging feeling that something was very wrong growing stronger with each step she took. Mr. Daniels was reviewing financial reports in his home office when his phone buzzed. A text message from Sarah Chen's mother contained a video attachment. You need to see this immediately, the message read. He pressed play and his heart nearly stopped. The classroom scene unfolded before his eyes. His son Jordan standing calmly at his desk, Mrs. Collins's face contorted with anger, and then the shocking moment when her hand struck his son's face. The phone trembled in his grip as rage and disbelief washed over him. Oh, hell no, he muttered, his jaw clenching. He replayed the video 3 times, each viewing stoking his anger further. The composed businessman facade cracked as paternal instinct took over. He grabbed his car keys and headed for the door. The hallways of Brighton Academy were quiet when Mr. Daniels strode through them, his footsteps echoing against the polished floors. Without bothering to check in at the front office, he headed straight for Principal Grant's office, his normally friendly face set in stone. Principal Grant looked up in surprise as Mr. Daniels entered without knocking. Marcus, I wasn't expecting. Have you seen the video? Mr. Daniels interrupted, placing his phone on the principal's desk. His voice was controlled, but carried an edge that made Principal Grant sit up straighter. I've heard some concerning reports, but watch it. Now. Mr. Daniels's tone left no room for argument. Principal Grant's expression changed as he watched the footage, his face growing more troubled with each second. When it ended, he removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. Marcus, I assure you, we'll conduct a thorough investigation. An investigation? Mr. Daniels leaned forward, his hands flat on the desk. Your teacher struck my son in front of an entire class. What exactly needs investigating? We have procedures that need to be followed, Principal Grant explained, though his voice lacked conviction. Mrs. Collins has been with us for 15 years. And that gives her the right to assault my child? Mr. Daniels' voice rose slightly. How many other students has she targeted? How many incidents have been swept under the rug? Principal Grant held up his hands. I understand your anger. We'll launch an internal inquiry immediately. But please, let's handle this professionally. Professionally? Mr. Daniels straightened up, adjusting his tie. I'll tell you what's going to happen. You're going to suspend Mrs. Collins' pending investigation, and you're going to do it today. Otherwise, the next call I make will be to my lawyers. Later that evening, Mr. Daniels found Jordan sitting at his desk, attempting to focus on homework. He knocked gently on the open door. Can we talk, son? Jordan nodded, turning in his chair to face his father. Mr. Daniels sat on the edge of the bed, studying his son's face. Why didn't you tell me what happened? Jordan shrugged, looking down at his hands. I didn't want to make a big deal out of it. It is a big deal, Jordan. What she did was wrong, and she needs to be held accountable. Dad, Jordan hesitated, his confident facade cracking slightly. If this gets out, everyone will be talking about it. The whole school, maybe even the local news. I don't want to be known as the kid who got slapped by his teacher. Mr. Daniels moved closer, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. Sometimes standing up for what's right means facing uncomfortable attention, but staying silent? That's letting her win. That's letting her keep doing this to other kids. Jordan met his father's eyes, uncertainty written across his face. What if people don't believe me? There's video evidence, son, and more importantly, you've got me in your corner. We'll face this together. Jordan fell silent, wrestling with the decision. The weight of going public with the incident pressed heavily on his young shoulders, while his father waited patiently for his response. Brighton Academy's pristine reputation began to crack as news of the investigation spread through the community like wildfire. Principal Grant's official announcement, delivered via email to all parents, attempted to strike a diplomatic tone. "We take all allegations of misconduct seriously and are conducting a thorough investigation into recent events." Mrs. Collins sat in her classroom during lunch break, crafting her own email to parents. Her fingers trembled slightly as she typed, "As an educator with 15 years of dedicated service, I want to address the misleading accusations being circulated. The incident in question has been grossly misrepresented. I was merely attempting to maintain order in a challenging situation." She hit send and leaned back in her chair, trying to ignore the whispers from passing students in the hallway. Her carefully constructed world was beginning to unravel, but she refused to accept responsibility. The response came swifter than anyone expected. By the next morning, the school board's inbox was flooded with emails from former students and their parents. Sarah Chen's mother, now a prominent local attorney, wrote a scathing account of how Mrs. Collins had consistently belittled her daughter 3 years ago. James Rodriguez's father shared a detailed letter describing incidents of unfair treatment dating back 5 years. "She always picked on the minority students," one former student wrote. "She'd make snide comments about our names, our families, our backgrounds, but she was careful, always just subtle enough that we couldn't prove anything." The school board members gathered in an emergency session, their faces grave as they reviewed the mounting evidence. Board President Helen Martinez rubbed her temples as she read through another complaint. "This goes beyond one incident," she said. "We're looking at a pattern of behavior spanning years." In his office, Principal Grant paced back and forth, phone pressed to his ear. Mr. Daniels's voice came through clearly. "These new allegations confirm what we already knew. How long has the school turned a blind eye to this?" "We're taking immediate action," Principal Grant assured him, though his voice lacked conviction. "I'm meeting with Mrs. Collins this afternoon." When Mrs. Collins entered his office later that day, her usual confidence had been replaced by barely concealed panic. Principal Grant gestured for her to sit down. "The situation has escalated beyond the initial incident," he began carefully. "We've received numerous complaints from former students and parents." Mrs. Collins's face hardened. "These people are just jumping on the bandwagon. They're trying to destroy my career over exaggerated claims." "There are too many consistent accounts to ignore," Principal Grant interrupted. "The board is recommending immediate suspension pending further investigation." Color drained from Mrs. Collins's face. "You can't do this to me. I've given everything to this school. Those students, they're the ones who need discipline. Jordan Daniels deliberately provoked me, and now his father is using his influence to—" "That's enough," Principal Grant said firmly. "The video speaks for itself, and these new allegations paint a disturbing picture. We have no choice but to take action." Mrs. Collins stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "I won't be made a scapegoat for this institution's failures. If you suspend me, I'll go to the media. I'll tell them how this school pressures teachers to maintain its elite image at any cost." Principal Grant remained unmoved. "Are you threatening the school, Mrs. Collins?" She gathered her belongings with shaking hands, desperation evident in every movement. "I'm protecting myself," she said, her voice trembling. "And I'll do whatever it takes to save my reputation." The next morning, Mrs. Collins found her school email inbox flooded with messages. Her hands shook as she clicked through them, each one more vicious than the last. "You don't deserve to be a teacher," read one anonymous message. "How dare you hit a student and then try to cover it up," declared another. In the staff room during her free period, the usual friendly chatter died the moment she walked in. Teachers who normally greeted her warmly suddenly became intensely interested in their coffee cups or phones. Mrs. Collins made her way to the coffee machine, the silence deafening. "Good morning," she said, trying to maintain her composure. No one responded. Sarah Mitchell, who had taught alongside her for 8 years, gathered her papers and hurried out without a word. Another colleague shifted uncomfortably in his chair, avoiding eye contact. The message was clear. She had become a pariah. Mrs. Collins's hand trembled as she poured her coffee, spilling some on the counter. As she reached for a paper towel, she heard whispers behind her. I always knew something wasn't right with her. Did you hear about what happened 3 years ago? The coffee forgotten, Mrs. Collins rushed out of the staff room, barely making it to the bathroom before the tears started falling. She stared at her reflection in the mirror, hardly recognizing the desperate woman looking back at her. Later that afternoon, Principal Grant sat at the head of the long table in the boardroom, surrounded by stern-faced school board members. The tension in the air was palpable as they reviewed the mounting evidence against Mrs. Collins. The video has over 10,000 views now, Board Member Thompson reported grimly. Local news stations are starting to pick up the story. Our phones haven't stopped ringing, added Helen Martinez, the board president. Parents are demanding immediate action. We can't afford to appear hesitant or indecisive. Principal Grant nodded solemnly. I understand. What do you propose? Immediate suspension, Martinez stated firmly, pending a full investigation. We need to show we're taking this seriously. When Mrs. Collins was called into the boardroom, her face was already set in a defensive scowl. As Principal Grant delivered the news of her suspension, her complexion turned from pale to red. This is outrageous, she exploded, slamming her hand on the table. You're all turning against me because of one misunderstanding? Because of some manipulated video? Mrs. Collins, Martinez interjected. Multiple witnesses have corroborated. Lies, all of it, Mrs. Collins screamed, her voice cracking. She grabbed her purse and stormed toward the door. You'll be hearing from my lawyer. That evening, Mrs. Collins's husband, David, sat at their kitchen table, his face drawn with concern as he scrolled through his phone. The local news website displayed the headline, Elite Private School Teacher Suspended After Assault Allegations. Karen, he said quietly as she prepared dinner, why didn't you tell me about this? The sound of chopping vegetables stopped abruptly. Tell you about what? The video, Karen, the slap, everything that's happening at school. His voice was heavy with disappointment. I had to hear about it from Tom at work. His kid goes to Brighton. Mrs. Collins's back stiffened. It's all being blown out of proportion. That boy was deliberately provoking me, and the video doesn't show the whole story. So you did hit him? David stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. Look at me, Karen. Did you actually hit a student? She turned to face him, her eyes wild. You're supposed to be on my side, not you too. The knife clattered into the sink as she backed away from him. Everyone's against me. Everyone's trying to destroy me. David watched his wife's erratic behavior with growing alarm. After 15 years of marriage, he was seeing a side of her he'd never witnessed before. Karen, I think you need help. Help? She laughed hysterically. I need people to stop believing lies about me. I need my husband to trust me. She grabbed her car keys from the counter. I can't stay here if you don't believe me either. Jordan Daniels sat on the edge of his bed, fidgeting with the corner of his blanket, as his father pulled up the desk chair to sit across from him. The evening light cast long shadows through the window, matching the heaviness in Jordan's heart. Son, we need to talk about what happened, Mr. Daniels said gently. I know it's not easy, but I'm here to listen. Jordan took a deep breath. Dad, I'm scared, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Not of Mrs. Collins, but of what happens next. Everyone's going to be talking about me. What if this follows me forever? Mr. Daniels leaned forward, his eyes filled with understanding. Being brave doesn't mean you're not afraid, Jordan. It means doing what's right despite that fear. I know what she did was wrong, Jordan continued, his words coming faster now. But I don't want to be known as that kid who got slapped by his teacher. I don't want people looking at me differently or treating me like a victim. The following evening, Mr. Daniels transformed their living room into a safe space for other families affected by Mrs. Collins. 5 sets of parents and their children gathered, sharing stories that made Jordan's eyes widen with recognition. She always singled out my daughter Maria, Mrs. Rodriguez shared, her voice trembling. Made her feel like she didn't belong because English isn't her first language. Another parent, Mr. Thompson, nodded. My son Marcus switched classes last year because of her. We didn't know how to prove what was happening, but he would come home crying. As Jordan listened to story after story, something shifted inside him. These weren't just isolated incidents. They were part of a pattern that had hurt too many students for too long. Tasha, who had come to support Jordan, squeezed his hand. You're not alone in this, she whispered. And maybe by speaking up, you can help make sure no one else has to go through what we did. The stories continued late into the evening. Some parents cried as they spoke about their children's experiences. Others expressed anger at how long Mrs. Collins had been allowed to maintain her behavior. But underneath it all was a current of hope. Hope that things could finally change. The next morning, Jordan sat with his father and Tasha in their kitchen, discussing his decision to speak to the school board. I want to do it, Jordan said firmly. Not just because of what she did to me, but because of everyone else too. He paused, collecting his thoughts. But I don't want this to be about revenge or getting Mrs. Collins fired. I want it to be about making things better. Mr. Daniels smiled proudly. What do you mean, son? I want to talk about creating better ways to report teacher misconduct, Jordan explained. About having regular check-ins with students about how they're being treated. About making sure teachers understand that their words and actions can affect students for years. Tasha beamed at her friend. That's perfect, Jordan. This isn't just about one teacher, it's about fixing the whole system. And that's exactly why your voice needs to be heard, Mr. Daniels added, placing a supportive hand on Jordan's shoulder. You're not just thinking about yourself, you're thinking about making lasting change. Jordan nodded, feeling stronger than he had in days. The fear was still there, but it no longer felt overwhelming. Instead, it was overshadowed by a sense of purpose and the knowledge that he wasn't fighting this battle alone. Mrs. Collins sat in her lawyer's dimly lit office, her hands trembling as she clutched her purse. Attorney James Maxwell paced behind his desk, his expensive suit and aggressive demeanor making her both nervous and hopeful. Listen, the only way out of this mess is to go on the offensive, Maxwell declared, stopping to lean over his desk. We need to paint this kid as an attention seeker who's making up stories. Mrs. Collins shifted uncomfortably in her chair. But there's a video. Videos can be misleading. Maxwell waved his hand dismissively. We'll say it was taken out of context. The real story is about a troubled student trying to ruin a dedicated teacher's career. Later that afternoon, Mrs. Collins made several carefully planned phone calls to influential parents in the school community. I hate to say this, she whispered into the phone, her voice dripping with false concern. But Jordan has a history of disrupting class. This whole incident is just another cry for attention. But her plan backfired spectacularly. Within hours, her phone calls sparked a chain reaction she hadn't anticipated. Parents began sharing their own stories on social media and in community groups. If Jordan's such a troublemaker, why does every other teacher praise him? One parent posted. My daughter had Mrs. Collins last year, and she came home crying almost every day, another shared. The situation grew even more tense when Maxwell took matters into his own hands. Without consulting Mrs. Collins, he leaked an email to local news stations. The doctored message appeared to show Jordan threatening Mrs. Collins before the incident. I'll make you sorry, the fake email read, dated just days before the slap. The story exploded across local news channels. Troubled student or victimized teacher, flashed across screens. Social media erupted with conflicting opinions and the school's phone lines were flooded with calls from concerned parents on both sides. Mrs. Collins watched the chaos unfold from her living room, a mix of relief and guilt washing over her. But even as some voices rose to defend her, more parents and former students continued coming forward with their own stories of mistreatment, drowning out the temporary support the fake email had generated. This is just making everything worse, she whispered to herself, watching another news segment about the controversy. The face in her mirror looked older, more haggard than it had just days ago. For the first time, she began to wonder if her desperate attempts to save herself might actually be sealing her fate. Mr. Daniels sat in his home office, scrolling through his contacts until he found Sarah Chen, a highly recommended private investigator. He'd spent the previous night tossing and turning, knowing he needed to take decisive action to protect his son from Mrs. Collins's smear campaign. "I need someone who can dig deep," Mr. Daniels explained during their meeting the next morning. "There's got to be a pattern here. Teachers like this don't just start behaving this way overnight." Sarah nodded, her experienced eyes already gleaming with understanding. "I'll start with her employment history. 3 schools in 10 years is unusual for a teacher with her credentials." Over the next few days, Sarah methodically built a disturbing picture of Mrs. Collins's past. She uncovered sealed complaints from her previous schools, speaking with former administrators who had been afraid to come forward. Each conversation revealed another layer of misconduct, carefully buried under settlements and non-disclosure agreements. Meanwhile, Jordan Daniels prepared himself for the upcoming school board meeting. In his bedroom, he practiced his speech while his father listened attentively. "Remember, son," Mr. Daniels advised, "your strength is in your truth. You don't need to raise your voice to be heard." The school board meeting room was packed when Jordan Daniels approached the podium. Parents, teachers, and community members filled every seat, with others standing along the walls. Mrs. Collins sat in the back row, her face tight with barely contained anger. Jordan Daniels adjusted the microphone, his hand steady despite the butterflies in his stomach. "Good evening," he began, his voice clear and measured. "I'm here to tell you what happened in Mrs. Collins's classroom last week, but I'm also here to talk about something bigger." The room fell silent as Jordan Daniels recounted the events leading up to the slap. He described Mrs. Collins's pattern of targeting minority students, her attempts to humiliate him, and finally, the moment she lost control. Throughout his testimony, he maintained a dignified composure that made his words even more powerful. "This isn't about revenge," Jordan Daniels concluded. "It's about making sure no other student has to feel unsafe in their classroom." The silence that followed his words was broken by supportive murmurs and nodding heads throughout the room. From her corner, Mrs. Collins's glare intensified, but Jordan Daniels didn't flinch. His quiet confidence had transformed the atmosphere in the room, making her anger seem small and petty in comparison. The next morning, Sarah Chen delivered her final report to Mr. Daniels and the school board. The thick folder contained statements from former students spanning nearly a decade, detailed accounts of similar incidents, and copies of official complaints that had been buried by previous administrators. "There's a clear pattern here," Sarah explained, pointing to highlighted sections in her report. "At least 7 documented incidents of physical contact with students, dozens of complaints about discriminatory behavior, and multiple settlements with families who agreed to stay quiet." The school board members exchanged concerned glances as they reviewed the evidence. The board president's face grew increasingly grave as she read through the testimonies. "This goes beyond a single incident," she announced. "We need to escalate this investigation to the state level." The evidence was impossible to ignore. What had started as one shocking moment captured on video had evolved into a years-long pattern of abuse of power and discrimination. Mrs. Collins's attempts to discredit Jordan Daniels had only served to bring her own misconduct into sharper focus. The school board's announcement of a formal hearing against Mrs. Collins came on a crisp Monday morning. Local news crews gathered outside the administrative building as the board president delivered the statement, her voice firm and resolute. "After reviewing substantial evidence, the board has determined that a formal hearing is necessary to address the serious allegations against Mrs. Collins," she declared. Before she could finish, Mrs. Collins's lawyer, Richard Maxwell, pushed his way to the microphones. His expensive suit and aggressive demeanor created an immediate stir among the reporters. "This is nothing but a witch hunt," Maxwell announced, his voice sharp with practiced indignation. "The board has already shown clear bias against my client. We demand an independent investigation." Later that week, during a packed community town hall at the local community center, the true impact of Mrs. Collins's actions became painfully clear. Amanda Rodriguez, now a college student, stood at the podium, her hands trembling slightly as she spoke. "I was in Mrs. Collins's class 5 years ago," Amanda began, her voice cracking. "She would constantly single me out, make comments about my accent, and once grabbed my arm so hard it left bruises." Tears rolled down her cheeks as she continued. "I was too scared to tell anyone because she said nobody would believe me. The room fell silent as Amanda's story unfolded. News cameras captured every word, and social media exploded with support for her courage. The school's name began trending online, drawing national attention to the growing scandal. Sarah Chen, the private investigator, then delivered the most damaging revelation yet. Standing before the gathered crowd, she methodically laid out her findings. "We've uncovered evidence that 3 separate schools actively covered up Mrs. Collins's behavior," she explained, displaying documents on a projector screen. Each institution chose to quietly transfer her rather than address the complaints. They paid settlements to families, had them sign non-disclosure agreements, and essentially helped Mrs. Collins continue her pattern of abuse. Gasps echoed through the room as Sarah revealed redacted copies of settlement agreements and internal memos discussing the cover-ups. One memo, dated 3 years prior, explicitly stated, "Transfer recommended to avoid potential media attention and legal exposure." The evidence painted a disturbing picture of institutional failure, showing how multiple schools had prioritized their reputations over student safety. Parents in the audience shook their heads in disbelief, while school board members looked increasingly uncomfortable. Jordan Daniels and his father sat in the front row, watching as the full scope of Mrs. Collins's history came to light. The revelation that her behavior had been systematically hidden for years transformed what had seemed like an isolated incident into something far more sinister. Mrs. Collins, who had been sitting stiffly in the back of the room with her lawyer, grew visibly pale as her past was exposed. Her carefully constructed facade of professionalism crumbled with each new detail Sarah Chen revealed. The school board's decision came swiftly. Mrs. Collins received the formal suspension notice on a Thursday morning, her hands shaking as she read the document. All her years of carefully maintained control had crumbled in a matter of weeks. That evening, her husband James confronted her in their living room, his face drawn with disappointment and anger. Their 2 children, Amy and Michael, waited upstairs with packed bags. "I've seen the evidence, Patricia," James said, his voice heavy with emotion. "The settlements, the cover-ups, years of hurting children. How could you?" Mrs. Collins reached for him, but he stepped back. "James, please, I can explain." "No more explanations," he cut her off. "No more lies. The kids and I are leaving. We're staying with my sister until I figure out what's next." "Yeah." The children didn't look back as they followed their father out the door, leaving Mrs. Collins alone in the empty house. The next morning, Richard Maxwell, her lawyer, called an emergency meeting at his office. His usual confident demeanor was replaced with grim resignation. "I'm withdrawing from your case, Mrs. Collins," he announced. "The evidence against you is overwhelming. Continuing would only damage my firm's reputation." "You can't abandon me now," Mrs. Collins pleaded, her carefully maintained composure finally breaking. "Everyone else has left me. You're all I have left." Maxwell simply shook his head and slid a formal withdrawal notice across his desk. Meanwhile, the school grounds transformed into a sea of students wearing white shirts with "Justice for All" printed in bold letters. The peaceful protest, organized by the student council, drew hundreds of participants. They carried signs reading "Protect all students" and "No more cover-ups." Jordan Daniels stood at the center of the gathering, surrounded by supportive classmates. Tasha handed out pamphlets outlining proposed changes to the school's disciplinary policies. Mr. Daniels watched proudly from the sidelines as his son addressed the crowd. Students from neighboring schools joined the demonstration, their presence highlighting how the case had touched a nerve in the broader community. Parents, teachers, and local civil rights activists stood shoulder to shoulder with the students, their unified presence sending a powerful message about the need for change. Local news crews captured the scene as speaker after speaker shared stories of discrimination and called for stronger protections for minority students. The peaceful yet powerful demonstration showed how one brave act could inspire an entire community to stand up against injustice. Mrs. Collins watched the coverage from her empty home, the TV's glow illuminating her tear-stained face as she witnessed the collapse of everything she had built. Her phone remained silent. No calls from James, no messages from her children, no reassurances from her lawyer. The weight of her actions and their consequences finally settled fully upon her shoulders. The school board hearing room buzzed with tension as people filed in on Monday morning. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating the long wooden table where 7 board members sat in pressed suits and serious expressions. Mrs. Collins perched stiffly in her chair, her new lawyer, a young, nervous man named Timothy Brooks, shuffling papers beside her. Jordan Daniels sat between his father and their private investigator, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to Mrs. Collins's obvious agitation. The room fell silent as Board President Helen Martinez called the hearing to order. Mrs. Collins spoke first, her voice quavering despite her attempt to sound confident. "The accusations against me have been greatly exaggerated," she insisted, smoothing her jacket repeatedly. "Jordan Daniels has always been a challenging student who—" "Do you have any evidence to support these claims about Jordan's behavior?" Board member Dr. Thompson interrupted, peering over his glasses. Timothy Brooks cleared his throat. "We have Mrs. Collins's detailed accounts of classroom disruptions, written after the incident in question," Dr. Thompson noted dryly. Mrs. Collins's face flushed as she realized how weak their defense sounded. Her lawyer's inexperience showed as he fumbled through papers, trying to find supporting documentation that didn't exist. When Mr. Daniels stood to present his evidence, the contrast was striking. He moved with quiet confidence, placing a thick folder on the table. "What you're about to see represents years of documented misconduct," he began, nodding to the private investigator who distributed copies to each board member. Mrs. Collins's face drained of color as Mr. Daniels methodically presented complaint after complaint from her previous schools. The private investigator had uncovered written statements from former students describing similar incidents of physical and emotional abuse, particularly targeting minority students. "But perhaps most telling," Mr. Daniels continued, holding up a notarized document, "is this sworn statement from Mrs. Collins's former teaching assistant, Sarah Chen." He began reading. "I witnessed Mrs. Collins repeatedly single out minority students for harassment and unfair punishment. When I reported my concerns, I was transferred to another school." Mrs. Collins gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white. Her lawyer whispered something in her ear, but she barely seemed to hear him. The room grew even quieter as Walter Richardson, a former principal from Westbrook Academy, took the stand. His silver hair and weathered face commanded attention as he cleared his throat. "I'm here today because I can no longer live with my conscience," he began, his voice heavy with regret. 8 years ago, when Mrs. Collins taught at my school, we received multiple complaints about her behavior toward minority students. Instead of addressing the issue, we chose to transfer her quietly to avoid negative publicity. Gasps filled the room. Board President Martinez leaned forward. "Are you saying there was a deliberate cover-up?" Richardson nodded slowly. "We were more concerned with the school's reputation than the students' well-being. I'm deeply ashamed of that decision now." The board members exchanged shocked glances. Mrs. Collins slumped in her chair, her carefully constructed defenses crumbling around her. Her lawyer had stopped taking notes entirely, staring at Richardson with a mix of horror and fascination. "How many other schools?" Board member Garcia asked. "At least 3 that I know of," Richardson replied. Each time the pattern was the same. Complaints would surface, and rather than address them, the administration would quietly move Mrs. Collins to another school. "We all failed these students terribly." Mrs. Collins's hands trembled as she reached for her water glass, nearly knocking it over. The evidence against her had become overwhelming, and even her desperate attempts to discredit Jordan Daniels seemed pathetic in light of these revelations. Jordan Daniels approached the podium, his shoulders straight but his hands slightly trembling. The boardroom fell silent as he adjusted the microphone. His father gave him an encouraging nod from his seat. "I always loved school," Jordan began, his voice steady despite his nerves. "But in Mrs. Collins's class, that changed. The day she slapped me wasn't just about the physical pain. It was about feeling worthless, about being singled out because of who I am." He described how Mrs. Collins would constantly interrupt him during discussions, mock his answers, and give him unfair demerits for minor infractions. "She made me question myself every day. I started dreading going to class, wondering what I'd done wrong just by existing." When he recounted the slap incident, his voice grew stronger. "I simply asked her to explain her position. Instead of answering, she struck me across the face in front of everyone. No student should ever feel unsafe in their classroom." Mrs. Collins shifted uncomfortably in her seat as her lawyer stood for cross-examination. "Isn't it true that you repeatedly challenged my client's authority?" the lawyer pressed. Jordan remained composed, his response measured. "I participated in class discussions and asked questions when I didn't understand something. That's what good students do." He paused, looking directly at Mrs. Collins. "A teacher should lift up their students, not tear them down." The lawyer's following questions grew increasingly desperate, but Jordan's calm demeanor never wavered. Each attempt to paint him as a troublemaker only highlighted Mrs. Collins's inappropriate behavior. When Tasha took the stand next, her usual shyness was replaced with quiet determination. "I've watched Mrs. Collins target students like Jordan and me for years," she testified. "She'd praise white students for the same answers she'd criticize us for. She'd interrupt our presentations but let others speak freely." Tasha's voice grew stronger as she continued. "Once she told me my natural hair was unprofessional and suggested I do something about it. When my mother complained, Mrs. Collins claimed she was just trying to help me fit in." She described witnessing multiple incidents where Mrs. Collins had belittled minority students. "The day she slapped Jordan, I wasn't surprised. I was just scared because I knew it could have been any one of us." The board members listened intently, their expressions growing increasingly troubled as Tasha detailed more examples of Mrs. Collins's discriminatory behavior. Mrs. Collins's face had turned ashen, and her lawyer had stopped taking notes entirely. The morning after Jordan and Tasha's testimonies, the school's parking lot filled with angry parents. Their voices echoed across the campus as they demanded answers about years of ignored complaints. Phone lines at the school board office rang constantly, and email inboxes overflowed with messages from concerned community members. "How many other students suffered in silence?" demanded one parent during an impromptu gathering outside the school gates. "Our children deserved better." Mr. Daniels stood among the crowd, watching as more parents arrived with handmade signs. Some read "Justice for Jordan" in bold letters, while others proclaimed "No more cover-ups" and "Protect our kids." The peaceful protest grew larger by the hour, drawing attention from local residents and passing cars. By midday, news vans lined the street. Reporters positioned themselves in front of the growing crowd, their cameras capturing the sea of signs and determined faces. Parents took turns sharing their children's experiences with Mrs. Collins, each story adding fuel to the community's outrage. "My daughter came home crying 3 years ago," one mother told a reporter, her voice shaking. "Mrs. Collins told her she'd never succeed because she didn't fit in. We complained, but nothing changed." Inside the school board office, members huddled around a conference table, watching the news coverage on a mounted TV. The chairman's phone buzzed continuously with messages from district officials and concerned citizens. Mrs. Collins sat alone in her car, parked a block away from the school. She watched the protest through her rearview mirror, her hands gripping the steering wheel. Her phone rang. It was her lawyer. "I'm withdrawing from your case," he said firmly. "The evidence against you is overwhelming, and I cannot continue to represent you in good conscience." Mrs. Collins's protests fell on deaf ears as the lawyer explained that his firm couldn't risk the negative publicity. The call ended abruptly, leaving her in silence. She stared at the protest signs visible in her mirror, the reality of her situation finally sinking in. Without legal representation, she would have to face the remainder of the hearing alone. The crowd outside the school continued to grow. Students who had graduated years ago arrived to show their support, sharing their own stories of encounters with Mrs. Collins. Jordan watched from his father's office window as his classmates joined the protest, many wearing school colors to show unity. "Look at what you started," Mr. Daniels said softly, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "You gave them the courage to speak up." The protest remained peaceful but determined. Parents organized shifts to maintain a constant presence outside the school, ensuring their message couldn't be ignored. News crews conducted interviews well into the afternoon, broadcasting the community's demands for justice across local channels. Mrs. Collins stood in her empty kitchen, the silence of her home pressing in around her. The house felt cavernous without her husband and children, their absence a constant reminder of everything she'd lost. Her hands trembled as she picked up a framed family photo from the counter. "This isn't fair," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I was just trying to maintain order." Tears rolled down her cheeks as she sank to the floor, still clutching the photo. Years of complaints, accusations, and covered-up incidents flashed through her mind. Deep down, a tiny voice whispered that she had been wrong, that her treatment of students like Jordan had been cruel. But she pushed the thought away. "I'm a good teacher," she repeated to herself, rocking slightly. "They're the ones who don't understand." But even as she said the words, doubt crept in. The empty rooms of her house seemed to mock her denials. Later that evening, Mrs. Collins drove to board member Richard Thompson's house. Her hand shook as she rang the doorbell, clutching her purse tightly. When he answered, she forced a smile. "Mr. Thompson, I need your help," she said, her voice desperate. "I can make it worth your while." She opened her purse, revealing an envelope stuffed with cash, her entire savings. "Please, just speak in my favor at the next hearing." Thompson's face hardened. "Mrs. Collins, are you trying to bribe me?" No, she backpedaled quickly. "I just thought—" "Leave now," Thompson cut her off, "before I call the police, and expect to hear from the committee about this." Within hours, news of Mrs. Collins's attempted bribery spread like wildfire. Local news stations interrupted their regular programming to report on the development. Social media exploded with outrage, and parents called for immediate action. Breaking news: suspended teacher attempts to bribe school board member, the headline screamed. Footage showed Thompson giving a statement outside the board offices, describing the incident in detail. The school board convened an emergency meeting. "This is beyond simple misconduct," the chairman announced to the assembled members. "We need to consider revoking her teaching license entirely." The other board members nodded gravely, reviewing the mounting evidence against Mrs. Collins. The slap, the history of complaints, the cover-ups at previous schools, and now the attempted bribery. The case had grown far beyond what anyone had initially imagined. The morning after the bribery scandal broke, Jordan sat at his kitchen table staring at his phone in amazement. His social media was flooded with messages of support from people he'd never met. Local civil rights activists praised his courage. Former students from other schools shared their own stories of discrimination, thanking him for speaking up. "Look at this, Dad," Jordan said, his voice filled with wonder. He showed his father a message from Maria Rodriguez, a well-known education advocate. "She wants to feature my story in her next speaking engagement about school reform." Mr. Daniels squeezed his son's shoulder. "You've started something bigger than yourself, son. Your courage is inspiring others to speak up." Tasha called, her voice excited. "Jordan, have you seen the news? Everyone's talking about what happened. You're making real change happen." For the first time since the incident, Jordan felt the full weight of what his stand against Mrs. Collins meant. It wasn't just about one teacher or one school anymore. He was part of something much larger. That evening, the community center buzzed with energy as Mr. Daniels welcomed parents and students to an emergency meeting. The room was packed, with people standing along the walls and spilling into the hallway. "We're here tonight," Mr. Daniels began, "not just to discuss what happened with Mrs. Collins, but to ensure it never happens again." Parents shared stories of their children facing similar discrimination. Students spoke about feeling powerless in their classrooms. The atmosphere grew heavy with shared pain and determination. When Jordan raised his hand to speak, the room fell silent. He stood up, his voice clear and confident. "What happened to me was wrong, but just removing one teacher won't fix the problem. We need to build better relationships between teachers and students." He paused, looking around the room. "I propose we create a mentorship program. Pair new teachers with student representatives from different backgrounds. Let them learn from each other before problems start." The room erupted in applause. Parents and students alike nodded in approval. Tasha stood up next to him, adding, "We could also have regular forums where students can safely discuss their concerns with teachers and administrators." Mr. Daniels beamed with pride as he watched his son command the room. The scared boy who had hesitated to speak up was gone, replaced by a confident young leader. The next morning, the school board released its official statement. They would hold a final vote on Mrs. Collins's teaching license the following week. The announcement came with an acknowledgement of past failures and a commitment to implementing new protective measures for students. The board recognizes its responsibility to ensure every student feels safe and respected in our classrooms, the statement read. We are committed to making meaningful changes, including considering the excellent suggestions from our student body. Jordan read the announcement during breakfast, surrounded by his father and Tasha, who had come over to show her support. The kitchen was quiet as they absorbed the news. You did it, Tasha said softly, squeezing Jordan's hand. We did it, Jordan corrected her, looking at his father and best friend with gratitude. And we're just getting started. The local news vans parked outside their house served as a reminder of how far their fight for justice had come. What had started as one brave student standing up to an unfair teacher had grown into a movement for lasting change in their community. The school board chamber was packed to capacity on the morning of the final hearing. Mrs. Collins sat alone at a small table, her face drawn and pale. The board members filed in solemnly, taking their seats behind the raised platform. Board Chairman Stevens cleared his throat. This hearing will now commence to address the formal accusations against Mrs. Collins, including misconduct, racial bias, and attempts to obstruct our investigation. One by one, former students and teachers approached the podium. Their testimonies painted a dark picture of Mrs. Collins's 15-year teaching career. A former colleague described witnessing her belittle minority students. Past students shared stories of humiliation and discrimination. Mr. Daniels presented the private investigator's complete findings, which included documented complaints from 3 different schools. The pattern is clear, he stated firmly. This isn't about one incident. This is about years of systematic abuse of power. Jordan sat between his father and Tasha, watching as Mrs. Collins shifted uncomfortably in her chair. The evidence mounted higher and higher, like a wave about to crash. When it was Mrs. Collins's turn to speak, she rose on shaky legs. I'm being unfairly targeted, she insisted, her voice thin and reedy. These accusations are exaggerated. I've dedicated my life to teaching. But as she tried to defend herself, the board members referred to the stack of evidence before them. Each attempt to explain away her actions was met with documented proof to the contrary. And how do you explain the attempted bribery of board member Johnson? Chairman Stevens asked. Mrs. Collins's face flushed. I was desperate. You don't understand the pressure I was under. The board members exchanged glances. After a brief deliberation, they returned to their seats. Chairman Stevens leaned forward into his microphone. Based on the overwhelming evidence presented, this board will now vote on the revocation of Mrs. Collins's teaching license. The room fell silent as each member voted. Revoke. 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 7 times the word rang out, until Chairman Stevens announced, "The decision is unanimous. Mrs. Collins's teaching license is hereby revoked, effective immediately." Applause erupted throughout the chamber. Mrs. Collins gathered her belongings with trembling hands and walked toward the exit. Just before she reached the door, she paused, her shoulders slumped in defeat. Then she pushed through and disappeared. The crowd began to disperse, their faces showing relief and satisfaction. Justice had finally been served. The news of Mrs. Collins's license revocation spread like wildfire through social media and local news outlets. Outside the school board building, parents hugged their children while reporters gathered around Mr. Daniels and Jordan. "This isn't just about one teacher," Mr. Daniels said, his hand resting proudly on Jordan's shoulder. "This is about making sure every student feels safe and respected in their classroom." Jordan stood tall beside his father, Tasha beaming at his side. Students approached him with tears in their eyes, sharing their own stories of discrimination they'd been too afraid to tell before. Meanwhile, across town, Mrs. Collins sat in her empty kitchen, staring at her phone as it buzzed with notifications. Her bank account was running low, and job applications were met with immediate rejections as news of her misconduct spread. Her husband's lawyer had already served her divorce papers. She picked up the morning newspaper, her hands shaking as she read the headlines about her case. The comfortable life she'd built was crumbling around her. Her neighbors avoided eye contact when she checked her mail. The church she'd attended for 15 years had quietly removed her from their volunteer roster. Local journalist Sarah Martinez's explosive article in the Daily Chronicle hit the internet that afternoon. The piece, titled "Beyond the Collins Case, A System of Silence," detailed how 3 different schools had buried complaints about Mrs. Collins's behavior. "Internal documents reveal a disturbing pattern," Martinez wrote. "Administrators repeatedly chose to transfer Mrs. Collins rather than address serious allegations of discriminatory behavior. This raises urgent questions about how many other teachers like her remain protected by this system of willful ignorance." The article included interviews with former administrators who admitted to prioritizing the school's reputations over student welfare. It also featured testimonies from dozens of former students who had tried to report Mrs. Collins over the years. The exposé sent shockwaves through the educational community. The school board's phones rang constantly as parents demanded immediate policy changes. Board members scheduled an emergency meeting to discuss new accountability measures. "The Daniels family showed us that one voice can spark real change," Martinez wrote in her conclusion. "But their story also exposes how much work remains to be done." As evening fell, Jordan sat with Tasha on his front porch, watching reporters finally drive away from their street. "You really started something big," Tasha said softly. Jordan nodded, thinking about all the students who would never have to face what he did. "Sometimes," he replied, "you just have to stand up and say, enough is enough." The school auditorium buzzed with anticipation as students, parents, and teachers gathered for the community forum. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating faces both familiar and new. Principal Grant stood at the podium, introducing speakers who shared personal stories of discrimination and hope for change. When Jordan Daniels took the stage, the room fell silent. He stood tall, his voice clear and steady. "What happened to me wasn't just about one teacher or one moment," he said. "It's about creating a school where every student feels valued, regardless of their background." As Jordan spoke about his vision for compassionate education, Tasha watched from the front row, wiping tears from her eyes. Parents nodded in agreement, and teachers leaned forward, hanging on every word. When he finished, the entire auditorium erupted in applause, everyone rising to their feet. Later that afternoon, Mr. Daniels approached the podium, his presence commanding attention. "Today, I'm proud to announce the Jordan Daniels Scholarship Fund," he declared, his voice filled with emotion. "This fund will support minority students who face discrimination, ensuring they have the resources to pursue their education and stand up for what's right." The announcement sent waves of excitement through the crowd. Local business owners immediately pledged support, and parents began organizing fundraising events. Even former students called in to contribute, touched by the initiative's purpose. In the weeks that followed, Jordan found himself surrounded by younger students seeking guidance. During lunch breaks, he and Tasha set up informal mentoring sessions in the library. They created a safe space where students could share their concerns and learn to advocate for themselves. "Remember," Jordan told a group of 7th graders, "your voice matters. Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise." Tasha sat beside him, nodding encouragingly as students opened up about their own experiences. The mentoring sessions grew larger each week. Students who once stayed silent began speaking up in class, inspired by Jordan's example. Teachers noticed a shift in classroom dynamics as students gained confidence in expressing themselves respectfully. During one session, a shy student named Marcus raised his hand. "Before all this happened," he said, looking at Jordan, "I was scared to tell anyone when things felt unfair. But now I know it's okay to speak up." Tasha, who had grown into a confident mentor herself, smiled at Jordan. They both understood the impact their work was having on the school community. The ripples of change they'd started were transforming into waves of positive action. Mrs. Collins stood on the front porch of her former student's house, her hand trembling as she rang the doorbell. The autumn wind whipped around her, making her feel even more exposed and vulnerable. When the door opened, she recognized Sarah Martinez, now a college freshman whose face immediately hardened upon seeing her. "Mrs. Collins," Sarah said coldly, crossing her arms. "What are you doing here?" "Sarah, I came to apologize," Mrs. Collins stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "The way I treated you, the things I said—" "Save it," Sarah cut her off, shaking her head. 4 years of making me feel worthless can't be fixed with one apology." The door closed with a decisive click, leaving Mrs. Collins alone with her shame. Similar scenes played out across town as Mrs. Collins attempted to make amends. Each rejection felt like another weight added to her conscience. Some former students wouldn't even open their doors. Others shouted through windows telling her to leave. One parent threatened to call the police. At home, Mrs. Collins sat in her empty living room, surrounded by boxes her husband had packed before leaving with their children. Her phone buzzed, a text from her estranged husband. "The counselor's waiting. Don't skip this appointment." The counseling office was warm and inviting with soft lighting and comfortable chairs. Dr. Peterson, a gentle-voiced woman in her 50s, sat across from Mrs. Collins, noting how she fidgeted with her wedding ring. "Tell me about your childhood, Mrs. Collins," Dr. Peterson prompted. "What did you learn about people who were different from you?" Mrs. Collins hesitated, then spoke quietly. "My father. He always said certain people didn't belong in our neighborhood, our schools." Her voice cracked. "I never questioned it. I just absorbed it all." "And how did those beliefs influence your teaching?" Tears welled up in Mrs. Collins's eyes. "I favored certain students. I was harder on others. I told myself it was about maintaining standards, but..." She stopped, choking back a sob. "I was just perpetuating the same prejudices I grew up with." "Recognition is the first step," Dr. Peterson said softly. "But it's only the beginning." That evening, Mrs. Collins sat alone in her kitchen, absently stirring a cup of cold tea. The TV news played in the background until a familiar name caught her attention. She turned up the volume as the reporter spoke about the Jordan Daniels Scholarship Fund. The camera showed Jordan and his father speaking to a group of students. Jordan's voice was strong and clear. "Every student deserves to feel safe and respected in school. No one should ever have to endure what I did." Mrs. Collins watched as students shared stories of how the scholarship fund had helped them. She saw the positive changes flowing from the very incident that had destroyed her career. For the first time, she truly saw the impact of her actions, not just on Jordan, but on an entire community. Her hands shook as she reached for her phone and opened her notes app. She began typing, "To the school board and community." She paused, then deleted it. Instead, she wrote, "To all the students I failed." Tears fell onto the screen as she continued writing, finally ready to take full responsibility for the pain she had caused. The words flowed freely now, years of denial and defensiveness giving way to raw honesty. Mrs. Collins understood that while forgiveness might never come, the truth needed to be told, not for her redemption, but for the healing of those she had hurt. The school board meeting room buzzed with energy as members unveiled their comprehensive reform package. Charts and presentations detailed new policies that would reshape the school's approach to diversity and accountability. Board members spoke passionately about mandatory sensitivity training sessions, a new anonymous reporting system, and quarterly reviews of teacher conduct. "These changes will ensure that what happened with Mrs. Collins never occurs again," the board president announced, her voice firm and determined. Parents and teachers in attendance nodded in approval as she outlined the specific measures. In Jordan Daniels' classroom, Ms. Rodriguez, the new teacher, arranged desks in a circle rather than rows. Her warm smile and gentle demeanor immediately put students at ease. "In this classroom, every voice matters," she said, making eye contact with each student. "We're going to learn from each other, respect each other, and grow together." Jordan Daniels felt the tension in his shoulders release as Ms. Rodriguez handed out cards for students to share their thoughts and concerns anonymously. The atmosphere in the room was completely different from Mrs. Collins's rigid control. Here, students actually smiled and participated eagerly. "I want to know what matters to you," Ms. Rodriguez explained, "because your experiences and perspectives make our learning richer." She paused at Jordan Daniels' desk, giving him an encouraging nod. Later that afternoon, Principal Grant sat across from Mr. Daniels in his office, his usual confident posture replaced by a slump of regret. "I should have listened when parents first complained about Mrs. Collins," he admitted, running a hand through his graying hair. "I was so focused on maintaining the school's reputation that I ignored the warning signs." Mr. Daniels leaned forward in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "What matters now is that you're taking action. he said firmly. "The reforms you're implementing will protect future students. That's more important than dwelling on past mistakes." Principal Grant straightened up, drawing strength from Mr. Daniels' words. "You're right," he agreed. "We need to focus on building a better future for our students." He gestured to the new policy documents on his desk. "These changes are just the beginning." The two men discussed the implementation of the new measures. Their conversation focused on moving forward rather than looking back. Through the office window, they could see students leaving for the day, laughing and chatting, a sign that healing had already begun. The community center buzzed with excitement as people filled every seat in the auditorium. Colorful banners hung from the walls, and a large "Thank You Daniels Family" sign dominated the stage. Jordan Daniels sat in the front row beside his father, feeling both proud and slightly overwhelmed by all the attention. Tasha approached the podium, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the microphone. Taking a deep breath, she looked directly at Jordan Daniels and began to speak. "Before Jordan stood up to Mrs. Collins, I was afraid to use my voice," she said, her words growing stronger with each sentence. "He showed me that one person's courage can make a difference. Because of him, I learned that speaking up for what's right isn't just important, it's necessary." Tears glistened in her eyes as she continued. "Jordan didn't just help himself. He helped all of us find our strength." The audience burst into applause as Tasha finished her speech. Jordan Daniels felt his own eyes growing misty at his friend's words. During a quiet moment between presentations, Mr. Daniels turned to his son. His eyes were filled with emotion as he placed a hand on Jordan Daniels' shoulder. "Son," he said softly, "I want you to know how incredibly proud I am of you. You didn't just stand up for yourself, you stood up for what was right, even when it was difficult." His voice cracked slightly. "You showed more integrity and courage than most adults I know." Jordan Daniels leaned into his father's embrace, feeling the strength of their bond. "I learned it from you, Dad," he whispered. The evening transformed into a celebration as student performers took the stage. The school choir sang uplifting songs about unity and hope, their voices filling the auditorium with joy. A student jazz band played cheerful tunes that had people swaying in their seats. The mood was electric, completely different from the tense atmosphere that had dominated the school just weeks before. As the music played, community members chatted and laughed together, sharing stories and plans for the future. Children ran through the aisles, their faces painted with bright colors, while parents and teachers discussed the positive changes taking place at the school. The student performances continued, each one met with enthusiastic applause. A group of dancers moved gracefully across the stage to a song about breaking down barriers, and a student orchestra performed a piece about new beginnings. The joy in the room was palpable, washing away the last remnants of the difficult times they had overcome together. The local news station's bright lights illuminated Mrs. Collins as she sat across from the interviewer, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her usual defensive posture was gone, replaced by a visible weariness and humility. "I want to publicly apologize to Jordan Daniels, his family, and every student I've hurt through my actions," she said, her voice trembling. "My behavior was inexcusable. I let my prejudices cloud my judgment and failed in my duty as an educator." The interviewer leaned forward. "What made you decide to come forward now?" "I've had time to reflect on the damage I've caused," Mrs. Collins replied, wiping away a tear. "I'm stepping away from teaching permanently. It's the right thing to do." Later that week, Mrs. Collins stood nervously on the Daniels' front porch. When Mr. Daniels opened the door, she struggled to meet his gaze. "I know I don't deserve your time," she began, "but I needed to apologize to you and Jordan in person. What I did was unforgivable." Mr. Daniels listened quietly, his expression stern but not unkind. "Apologies are important," he said finally, "but they're just words. Real forgiveness has to be earned through actions and genuine change." Mrs. Collins nodded, understanding the weight of his words. At the community center, Mrs. Collins began volunteering in the after-school program. The children regarded her with suspicion at first, whispering among themselves when she entered the room. She started small, helping with homework and organizing art supplies. "Would anyone like help with their math?" she asked softly one afternoon, keeping her distance to let the children approach on their own terms. A small boy cautiously raised his hand. As Mrs. Collins sat down to help him, explaining the problems with patience and gentleness, other children began to watch with interest. Gradually, more students started asking for her help. "You explain things differently now," one girl observed while working on her multiplication tables. "You don't get mad when we make mistakes." Mrs. Collins felt a mix of shame and hope at the child's words. "Everyone deserves patience when they're learning," she replied quietly, the lesson finally sinking in after all these years. The evening sun cast long shadows through the Daniels' living room windows as Jordan and his father sat together on their comfortable old couch. The house was quiet, except for the gentle hum of the ceiling fan above them. "You know, son," Mr. Daniels said, placing a warm hand on Jordan's shoulder, "I've watched you grow so much these past few months. You've shown more courage than most adults I know." Jordan looked down at his hands, processing his father's words. "Sometimes I still can't believe everything that happened," he admitted, "but it feels different now, like I understand myself better." Mr. Daniels nodded. "Your actions didn't just help you. They showed others that speaking up matters." The doorbell rang, interrupting their conversation. It was Tasha, her face bright with excitement as she burst into the living room. "Jordan, I did it!" she exclaimed, practically bouncing on her toes. "I signed up for student council elections." Jordan's face broke into a wide smile. "That's amazing, Tasha." "It's because of you," she said, settling down on the couch beside him. "Watching you stand up to Mrs. Collins made me realize I have a voice too. I want to make sure every student feels heard and respected." Mr. Daniels quietly excused himself, leaving the two friends to talk. "I've already started working on ideas for new school policies," Tasha continued, "like a student advocacy group where kids can safely report problems." The next day at school, Jordan sat with a group of classmates in the library, surrounded by colorful poster boards and markers. They were designing a new peer support program called Students for Change. "What if we had weekly discussion groups?" one classmate suggested, sketching out a schedule. Jordan nodded enthusiastically. "And we could pair older students with younger ones so everyone has someone to talk to." The group worked together, building on each other's ideas. Jordan noticed how naturally everyone contributed now, unlike the tense atmosphere that had existed under Mrs. Collins. As he watched his classmates collaborate, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. This was what school should be like, a place where everyone felt valued and heard. Mrs. Collins's televised apology became the talk of every major news network. Her tearful admission of bias and misconduct sparked heated debates across social media platforms and news shows. Some viewers praised her courage in taking responsibility, while others dismissed it as a desperate attempt to salvage her reputation. "She's only sorry because she got caught," commented one viral post that gathered thousands of shares. "People can change. We should encourage accountability," argued another. The controversy intensified when educational experts began weighing in. Several major newspapers ran opinion pieces discussing the broader implications of her case for America's education system. Mrs. Collins found herself at the center of a national conversation about prejudice in schools, far beyond what she had anticipated. One quiet evening, as Mrs. Collins sorted through the mountain of responses to her public statement, an email caught her attention. The sender's name made her hands tremble: Marcus Chen, a student from 3 years ago. "Dear Mrs. Collins," the email began, "I watched your apology on TV. I need you to understand something." Marcus described how her subtle put-downs and dismissive attitude had affected his self-worth throughout high school. Though he had eventually succeeded, graduating with honors from a prestigious university, the emotional scars remained. "I appreciate that you're trying to change," he wrote, "but some wounds don't heal with just an apology. Your words made me doubt myself for years. I still sometimes hear your voice in my head, telling me I'm not good enough." The email left Mrs. Collins shaken. After several sleepless nights, she sat at her computer and began typing an open letter to the community. Her fingers moved steadily across the keyboard as she poured out her heart. "To everyone I've hurt," she began. "I've spent weeks reflecting on my actions and their impact. Marcus's email showed me that my behavior didn't just create momentary pain, it left lasting scars. She detailed her journey from denial to recognition, describing how deeply ingrained biases had poisoned her teaching. The letter acknowledged the system that had enabled her behavior and called for broader changes in education. "We must do better," she wrote, "not just as individual teachers, but as a society that shapes young minds." When the letter went viral, it sparked intense discussions about implicit bias in education. Teachers across the country began sharing their own stories of confronting prejudice in their classrooms. Parent groups organized workshops on recognizing and addressing systemic discrimination. The school auditorium buzzed with excitement as families gathered for the launch of the Jordan Daniels Scholarship Fund. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting a warm glow over the diverse crowd. Jordan Daniels sat beside his father on the stage, his hands folded neatly in his lap as he listened to the speakers. When Maria Rodriguez, the first scholarship recipient, took the podium, her eyes shone with tears. "Before Jordan Daniels stood up against injustice, I didn't think someone like me could dream big," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "You've changed my life before it even began." The words hung in the air as applause filled the room, and Jordan Daniels felt his father's strong hand squeeze his shoulder with pride. In the weeks that followed, Ms. Thompson, the new teacher who replaced Mrs. Collins, transformed Classroom 203 into a vibrant learning space. The walls displayed student artwork celebrating different cultures, and desks were arranged in small groups to encourage collaboration. She implemented the inclusive curriculum Jordan Daniels and his classmates had designed, making sure every student's voice was heard. "Today we're going to explore history through multiple perspectives," Ms. Thompson announced, as students eagerly pulled out their notebooks. The lesson plan, crafted with input from Jordan Daniels' team, sparked engaging discussions where everyone participated. Throughout the school, small but significant changes took root. In the cafeteria, students who once sat in segregated groups now mixed freely, sharing stories and laughter. Teachers attended weekly sensitivity training sessions, taking notes and asking thoughtful questions about creating inclusive environments. Parents volunteered more frequently, organizing cultural awareness events and participating in classroom activities. During recess, a group of sixth graders taught each other games from their different cultural backgrounds. In the library, students created a Stories of Our Families display, featuring photographs and essays about their diverse heritage. The school hallways echoed with conversations in multiple languages as students helped each other learn phrases from their native tongues. Mr. Daniels observed these changes with quiet satisfaction, watching his son's courage ripple through the school community like waves in a pond. Jordan Daniels had not only stood up for himself, but had helped create a template for lasting change that would benefit generations of students to come. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the cafe windows as Mrs. Collins nervously adjusted her blouse. She had arrived 15 minutes early, choosing a quiet corner table away from other patrons. Her hands trembled slightly as she sipped her water, watching the door with growing anxiety. When the Daniels family entered, Mrs. Collins's breath caught in her throat. Jordan Daniels walked beside his father, shoulders straight and head high, showing a confidence that made him seem older than his years. Mr. Daniels kept a protective hand on his son's shoulder as they approached the table. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me," Mrs. Collins said softly, her voice lacking its former authority. The father and son sat down across from her, their expressions guarded but not hostile. Mrs. Collins took a deep breath before speaking. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," she began, her voice cracking slightly. "I wanted to tell you specifically what I did wrong, not just make general apologies." She looked directly at Jordan Daniels. "I targeted you because of my own prejudices. I tried to diminish your intelligence, your confidence, your right to speak up in class. When you challenged me intellectually, I felt threatened instead of proud of having such a bright student." Tears welled in her eyes as she continued. "I betrayed everything I was supposed to stand for as a teacher. Instead of nurturing your potential, I tried to crush it. And when I struck you," she paused, visibly struggling with the memory. That was the moment I became everything I claimed to be fighting against. I failed you. I failed myself. And I failed every student who ever trusted me." Mr. Daniels remained silent, his expression stern but thoughtful. Jordan Daniels studied his former teacher's face, noting how different she looked without her usual mask of superiority. "I don't know if I can forgive you yet," Jordan Daniels said finally, his voice steady and clear. "But I hope you keep trying to be better." The simple wisdom in his words seemed to fill the small cafe space. Mrs. Collins nodded, accepting his response with surprising humility. She gathered her purse and stood up, understanding that the meeting had reached its natural conclusion. As she walked away from the table, her shoulders carried the weight of her actions. But there was also a slight lightening in her step, not from absolution, but from the possibility that her journey toward redemption had truly begun. The spring morning was crisp and clear as students, parents, and community members gathered in the school's courtyard. A large object stood covered in burgundy cloth near the entrance, drawing curious glances from the assembled crowd. Principal Grant stood at the podium, his demeanor more relaxed than it had been in months. "Today we honor not just change but the courage it takes to demand it," Principal Grant announced, gesturing toward the covered plaque. Mr. Daniels and Jordan Daniels stepped forward together, their matching ties reflecting the school's colors. With careful movements, they unveiled the bronze plaque that read, "In honor of courage and change." The crowd applauded as Principal Grant continued. "This plaque will remind future generations that one voice can spark a movement." He paused, adjusting his glasses before making another announcement. "I'm also proud to announce that our school will now celebrate an annual Diversity and Inclusion Day." Tasha, standing near Jordan Daniels, squeezed his hand in excitement as Principal Grant added, "And who better to lead our first celebration than Jordan Daniels and Tasha?" The two friends exchanged proud smiles as they stepped up to the podium. The courtyard buzzed with energy as students set up cultural displays and interactive workshops. Jordan Daniels and Tasha moved through the crowd, ensuring everything ran smoothly. Their leadership had transformed them both. Tasha's former shyness had given way to quiet confidence, while Jordan Daniels carried himself with an assured grace beyond his years. When it came time for Jordan Daniels to address the gathering, he stood at the podium, his voice clear and strong. "We can't undo the past," he began, looking out at the faces before him, "but we can build a future where everyone feels they belong." His words hung in the air, touching something deep within each person present. Parents wiped away tears, teachers nodded in agreement, and students listened intently as Jordan Daniels spoke. When he finished, the courtyard erupted in thunderous applause, the sound echoing off the school's brick walls. Mr. Daniels watched from the side, pride evident in his eyes as his son stood tall before the community he had helped transform. The autumn sunlight streamed through the classroom windows, casting a warm glow over the students working in small groups. Jordan Daniels sat at a circular table with Tasha and 3 other classmates, their heads bent together over a joint history project. The atmosphere was markedly different from the tense silence that had dominated Mrs. Collins's classroom months ago. "What if we include personal stories from different cultural perspectives?" Tasha suggested, her voice confident and clear. The other students nodded enthusiastically, jotting down notes and sharing ideas. Jordan Daniels looked around the room, taking in the scene. Students from all backgrounds chatted freely, their laughter mixing with the steady hum of productive discussion. The walls were adorned with student artwork celebrating diversity, and the new teacher, Ms. Martinez, moved between groups with an encouraging smile. "Jordan, what do you think about this section?" asked Marcus, one of his group members. Jordan Daniels leaned in, offering his thoughts while making sure everyone had a chance to contribute. The collaborative spirit that now filled the school hadn't happened overnight, but the change was undeniable and lasting. Later that evening, Jordan Daniels sat with his father in their living room. The television played quietly in the background as they shared a comfortable silence. Mr. Daniels looked up from his newspaper, studying his son's profile as Jordan Daniels worked on his homework. "You know something?" Mr. Daniels said softly, setting aside his reading. "You've done something incredible. Never forget the power of your voice." Jordan Daniels glanced up, meeting his father's proud gaze. The weight of those words settled over him, bringing back memories of the past months, the fear, the struggle, and finally, the triumph. "I couldn't have done it without you, Dad," Jordan Daniels replied, his voice thick with emotion. Mr. Daniels shook his head. "You had the courage inside you all along. I just helped you find it." They shared a moment of understanding, the bond between father and son stronger than ever. The living room lamp cast a gentle glow around them, making the moment feel almost sacred. Later that night, Jordan Daniels stood in his bedroom, holding a small piece of paper in his hands. It was a drawing from Tasha, simple but powerful. The artwork showed their school building surrounded by students of different colors holding hands. Across the top, in Tasha's neat handwriting, were the words, "You changed the world for us." With careful movements, Jordan Daniels pinned the drawing to his bedroom wall. He stepped back, taking in how it looked among his other mementos, photos of friends, academic awards, and newspaper clippings about the school's transformation. Each item told part of the story, but Tasha's drawing captured the heart of it all. Through his window, he could see the school building in the distance, its windows glowing softly in the evening light. The sight filled him with pride and hope. What had started as a stand against one teacher's prejudice had grown into something much bigger, a movement that had transformed not just the school, but the entire community. Jordan Daniels smiled, touching the corner of Tasha's drawing gently. The paper was simple, but its message was profound. In taking a stand, he hadn't just changed his own world, he had helped create a better one for everyone. If you enjoyed the story of Mr. Daniels, Jordan, and Mrs. Collins, I handpicked this next story that will touch your heart. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.